Welcome to The Economy. How do you measure that? Where we break down how we measure what's really going on in the economy one transaction at a time. I'm your host, Jim Tebrake. Today's episode, World Cup Volunteers. How do you measure that? Every World Cup relies on thousands of volunteers. They help fans find their seats, translate for visitors, guide media crews, and keep the tournament running smoothly. But here's the question. If all this work is being done for free, does it show up in GDP? To help us understand this, I'm joined by Francien Berry. So let's start with that question, Francien. So if somebody volunteers at the World Cup, does that show up in GDP?
Thanks, Jim. Well, not exactly. Under the system of national accounts, unpaid labor is generally outside of the production boundary, and so it's not necessarily captured in GDP. GDP generally records market production, government production, and certain production by nonprofit institutions that have directly observable transactions associated with them. So
not in GDP. That's a bit surprising. All this great work, all this effort, and not in GDP.
Exactly, and that is one of the important limitations that GDP has. Even though we recognize that unpaid labor is important and has tremendous economic and social value, it doesn't necessarily show up in GDP.
Okay, so these volunteers, is it true that you don't record ever their activity, or do you have some tools to maybe recognize them a little bit?
Yes. So while we don't recognize the unpaid labor in GDP, we as statisticians, we actually encourage countries to capture the economic value of these volunteer and unpaid activity. So we have tools, countries have tools that they use, extended tables, satellite tables, or thematic tables where they can dig deep into these unpaid or volunteer accounts. So we actually capture the activity if you compile those tools.
Well, that makes me feel better because I've volunteered in the past a few times, and knowing that we have statisticians like yourself at least trying to, account for the value of that in some way is reassuring. So yes. Great. Now, sometimes these volunteers, hopefully they're fed or they're given a uniform or maybe something else. Does that show up in GDP? Is that anywhere?
Yes, those can show up in GDP if the volunteers get meals or transportation or other items. Those can be considered as compensation of employees, and they can show up, compensation in kind, and they can show up in the accounts. Otherwise, they can also show up as operating expenses on the part of the organizing committee. So although the unpaid labor does not show up in GDP, those expenses and benefits can actually show up in the accounts.
Okay. So a little bit shows up. Let's go international. So now these volunteers, the World Cup is global. So let's say a volunteer comes from another country to, say, Mexico, where some of the matches are being hosted. Does that show up? Does their volunteering show up in GDP? Does this show up in the balance of payments anywhere?
It can. For example, if these non-resident, let's say, volunteers show up in the host country, they contribute, they pay for meals, they pay for hotels and other services. That can show up as export of services on the part of the host country. So, of course, the labor doesn't show up, but the contribution, the economic contribution of the volunteers still show up in the accounts in some way or another.
Okay, that's interesting. So the host country gets free labor, from what I hear from you, plus they get some exports of services. So they're kind of getting a double bang for their buck.
Yes, they are. But the volunteers contribute, and they also get to see the matches for free. So
that's, and I'm sure that's a whole other episode that we want to talk about how people get these services for free and what that means. Well, Francien, this has been super insightful. That now we understand that volunteers are incredibly important for the World Cup, but they're not paid, and therefore that doesn't show up in GDP. So the next time you see a World Cup volunteer helping fans in the stadium, remember, even if their work doesn't fully appear in GDP, there's a statistician figuring out how to measure their economic impact. See you next time.